in an indirect way, this particular pick out of my top 50 favourite cars is kind of a throwback to number 40, featuring the ISO Griffo, because although this car has plenty to differentiate itself from that car, and also from another one of its rivals, the Jensen Interceptor, which has never been one of my favourites, but is certainly in the discussion against these kind of cars, the difference with this car, the Lamborghini Espada, is it's one of the relatively few classics which goes beyond just liking the car or loving the car, to the point where the Espada is one of those classics which for a long time I actually wanted to own one. And for me, and I touched on this in the Griffo episode, there are many cars which I really love, but I don't need to own. I can just enjoy them from an abstract perspective. Whereas there are some which I actually would like to own as well. And for me, there are two Lamborghinis actually which kind of occupy that space for me. The Espada and the LM002. Now, the LM002 is a very fluid favourite of mine. It doesn't appear on this list, spoiler alert, but it is one which I've always loved. I love the fact that it's so brash and radically different to any other Lambo. To me, it's a way nicer car than the Hummer, even though I am also a fan of the original Hummer. And it's just a cool idea to have this massive all-wheel drive off-road Lambo. And in a way, I'm kind of surprised that they actually went through and made it, especially after Hummer ended up getting the deal with the military. But this car is featured. So why is that the case when the LM002 isn't? Well, there's just something about certain cars, and everyone who has a favourite car knows what I mean by this. There are just some cars which have that special spark. For me, cars like the Cobra, as I mentioned in that episode, it's not particularly a groundbreaking car in any way. It's almost like a production hot rod, in effect, but everything just falls into place to make you love it. And for me, that's the case with the Espada. It's a car which most Lamborghini fans would probably have no way near their favourites. But that's the thing. I'm not a Lamborghini fan, and in a similar way to Ferrari, I love certain cars which they've made, but I'm not a huge fan of the brand itself. As I've mentioned before, I'm more of a fan of Maserati than I ever have been of Ferrari or Lambo, but there are certain cars within both of those brands that I adore. And for me, ever since I first saw this car, I immediately knew that it was my favourite Lamborghini, and that hasn't changed. And that was probably 10 years ago, and that's relatively rare for me to have a car to instantly become my favourite from a brand and just stay that way. That is such a rare thing to happen for me, but for the Espada, that's still the case. If I could actually own any Lambo, it would actually be either this or the LM002, but I think this one might just edge out the LM002 overall. And up until relatively recently, this was actually a classic which I would have put in my dream garage for a car which I would actually like to go out and buy if I could afford to. Now that has changed, to be honest, because a very powerful factor in many of my favourite cars, or more specifically dream cars, which, as I've mentioned before, I do have a big differentiation between the two. A favourite car is an abstract thing, whereas a dream car is something that I actually want to own and buy and work towards in a very real sense. That is not the case for this car anymore for me. It is one of my favourites, of course, that's why it's here, but it's not one of my dream cars anymore. And the main reason, to be honest, why that is the case now is actually for a reason which is great for the owner, but not for a buyer, and that is the value. The value of classic cars has gone through the roof, but for some reason for me, with the Espada, it's kind of put me off it a little bit from a dream car perspective, because I can still remember reading in car magazines like Classic and Sports Car, where you could literally find these Espadas for sale for like £10,000 to £20,000. You look at that now, and that sounds insane. A Lamborghini Espada for 10 grand. That is ridiculous, because now you're looking at easily six figures for one of these. For one which isn't even in perfect condition, you're looking at Maserati, like brand new Maserati money, 80 or 90 grand. Because all classics have gone up in value, even non-performance ones. So the knock-on effect is, of course, that these performance ones, especially rare ones like the Griffo and the Espada and the Jensen Interceptor, they just go up by massive increases in value, which, as I said, is great for somebody who bought one all those years ago, but it's not so good for a potential buyer because you've got to fork out so much more money. I mean, this thing is literally 10 times the price of when I first was introduced to it. And I first saw the Espada in a small classic car book. And funnily enough, I was actually introduced to the Espada and the LM002 at the same time. I believe the LM002 was literally the next page in the book. So I fell in love with both cars almost simultaneously. But they've both stayed ever since like a decade ago to this day as my two favourite Lamborghinis of all time, because they're so radically different. And in a funny kind of way, the Espada is actually a very similar concept, in fact even more so than the Grifo is. It's a similar concept to the Ferrari FF, which of course I have a lot of love for, because if you really compare the two, they are very similar. This Espada is almost like the FF of the 70s or late 60s. It doesn't have all-wheel drive, but it's got that shooting brake style almost, with the 2+2 seats. And the difference between this and even something like a Grifo is you can very clearly see from the design of the car that this is intended to be a proper four-seater, not just two token seats in there for the sake of it, where you have to be a double amputee to truly fit in the back. No, this is a proper four-seater, again like the FF, and I just love that. The first time I saw the Espada, I loved the stance, that front end bearing down on you with the wide grille, the 4 lamps. Very simple design, actually, a fairly normal looking Lamborghini compared to many others, to the point where you might even not know it was a Lamborghini unless you knew the brand. I just love the Espada. I always have. It's not a car that I bring up that often on the channel because there's no real need for it, but I love the car. And to this day, it is still my favourite Lamborghini. So, of course, spoiler alert, it's the highest that any Lambo is going to be on this list. So, of course, if you are new to the list, you can check out all of the other cars in my top 50 favourites by clicking through at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.